By the time our daughter Julie was 8 years old, she'd had 8 surgeries for a variety of reasons, tonsillectomy, ear tubes, but most significantly, she had had 2 major operations on her hip. And finally, the day arrived when the doctor went to her and said, "Well, Julie, I foresee one last operation. We'll call in a plastic surgeon and see what he can do about removing that big, long scar on your leg." To which Julie responded, "But I like my scar." Case closed. That was that, and the option has never been reconsidered. I like my scar. She was ahead of me on that one. At the time, I did not appreciate scars because they seemed to me like a public announcement that all was not right. Things were not perfect as they should have been. Something painful had occurred, and I wanted to do whatever could be done to erase the evidence. But over time, I have to acknowledge that learning to like or to truly appreciate life's scars has been a significant part of my learning curve. And it's not been easy. What do you do with the things in your past or even in your present which cause you suffering? If we only had a built-in delete button or a disposal for mental stress, our problems would be solved. But who was it who said, not even God can erase the past? A natural tendency is to curse the pain, to rue the day that the suffering first occurred. And with that comes the inclination to blame, to assign guilt to the other party, or maybe to oneself, or even to God. It's all about singing the "somebody did somebody wrong" song. That's a tune we've all sung at one time or another, and it comes to mind most readily when we are immersed in self-pity or regret. But blame isn't the only outgrowth of suffering. A second response is that of nursing the wound by continually reciting in one's mind the gory details. It's the syndrome that involves going over and over and over the fateful events time and again. Usually it involves a listener, but not always. Sometimes one rehearses in solitude. But either way, it's a way to make the scab continue to fester. So whether one curses the pain or the cause of the pain or nurses the suffering, the pain remains. So how does one find deliverance from suffering? How can we use our faith to extricate ourselves from the muck and the mire of past wounds? And how do we come to the point where we can like our own scars? I think Friedrich Buechner, a preacher and theologian, gave the answer when he wrote, "We make pain acceptable to ourselves. We make it holy by giving it away out of love. We offer to share it with each other. As wounded healers, we render our story, not with the intent to take away the other's suffering, because only God can do that, but we simply offer it up as part of the human condition. We say, in essence, this is what happened to me, and by God's grace, I survived." How easy it is to think back to all those times in life when we've been not only comforted but strengthened by someone else's words when they said, "I've struggled with that same thing," or "been there, done that," or "you're not alone." And as difficult as it may be to believe, God's grace is going to sustain you. You are going to make it through this. It's in moments like those when our pain ceases to be crippling and becomes instead mysteriously mobilizing. That's when pain can empower as nothing else can. Someone said, and I like this quote, "We know that our scabs have become scars when that which at one time looked for all the world like a loss becomes something that feels for all the world like a gain." In today's passage, Jesus appears to the disciples. They would have heard about Easter, about Mary Magdalene knowing that he was alive because she recognized his voice when he called her name. They would have heard that through Peter and John. And the voice, we have to admit, is a common way to identify people. But now, this time, notice that when Jesus appears before the men, he identifies himself not by his facial features, not by his voice, but by showing them his wounds, his wounded hands and feet. Why did he do that? Imagine walking into the police station and looking at wanted posters, and you see photos of only hands and feet, and the caption underneath reads, "Suspect has scar on right thumb. Toes are webbed. Little toe on left foot appears to have been broken." Normally, we cannot recognize people by their hands or by their feet unless we know them extremely well. In the Parlor of Peace, for example, there is a photograph of a pair of hands. Have you noticed that? They belong to someone who is very well known in this church, but I venture to guess that out of context, few could identify them. Yet here, Jesus is trusting that every one of his disciples will recognize his hands and feet. "Look at my hands and my feet," he says, "and see that it is I myself." And so they look at the hands, and they remember those very hands breaking bread and offering them wine. And they remember those hands pressing pads of mud against a blind man's eyes. And they remember those same hands tenderly touching the open sores of someone's leprosy. They look at the feet, and they saw the feet of someone with whom they had walked hundreds of miles. They knew those feet. They saw those feet that they remember having been anointed with tears by a woman who washed them with her hair. They knew those feet. But yet, I think it's not the fact that he's showing them his hands and his feet that's significant here. But what is important is that he is showing them his wounds. Jesus is offering his wounds as a source of healing for them. Well, how does that work? It works in that what he's showing them is how he wears his wounds. Not as a symbol of defeat. "I'm a victim. Look at what you missed because you were nowhere in sight. This is what happened. This is what they did to me." But instead, he wears them like a victor's medal. As if he's saying, "I survived that ordeal. And when your time comes, so will you. Death, be not proud, because by God's grace and power there is no such thing as death." That's what his wounds say. And that's what our wounds can say too. Soon, in 3 months to be exact, we will be listening to each other's faith journeys at the 8 a.m. services. And I think it's safe to say that in all likelihood, you will not be hearing stories of accomplishments or honors or great achievements, although that is more than applicable in many instances. But my guess is that people will be sharing their own personal war stories. They will be sharing their wounds. They will be sharing those times in their lives when God intervened and when he brought them up out of places of rejection to sanctuaries of acceptance, from pits of despair to plateaus of hope, from the agony of defeat to Christ-like success. That's how we share our wounds, to empower. For we can use our wounds as Jesus used his. Maybe that's the way they're meant to be used. In closing, I share with you a story about a teenage girl who always derided her mother because of her mother's ugly and scarred fingers. The daughter was embarrassed by them, and when friends would come to the house, she would make a point of mocking her mother, asking her, for example, to put on gloves so as not to gross them out. Until one day, out of nowhere, it occurred to her to ask her mother why her hands looked as they did. She'd seen them all her life, never asked the question. And then her mother responded, because they were burned in a fire. A fire, said the girl. I never knew anything about a fire. What happened? You were too little to remember. I rescued you from a burning crib. And then she looked at her daughter and she said, I know that these scars look ugly to you, but to me, I have the most beautiful hands in the world because these are what saved your life. I love these scars. So it is in a variety of ways we are called upon, by the help of God, to be wounded healers. Sometimes using our words, and at other times drawing on silent empathy. But whatever happens to us, we can trust that Christ's deliverance comes because of our wounds and through them. And for that reason, we are indeed blessed. We are blessed to be a blessing. Thanks be to God. Amen.